You're listening to the When Life Hands You Lennon's podcast.
But in an entry-level film production, it's one strike and you're out. You're fired. I'm not calling you back.
If your goal today is to make a basket, we're gonna make that basket.
The minute you create something, as soon as it's made tangible, you have a copyright in it.
How do I get our guys to sound that big, that full when they do the harmonies?
And I'm your host, Lennon Seahawk. Let's get to the show. Welcome to this week's episode of When Life Hands You Lennon's. Happy 2022. I'm very excited for this year. I have a lot of amazing guests planned and scheduled for this year. And the first episode of the year is going to be with Milana Lewis. She is the CEO of a music distribution company called STEM. Now, STEM is a very interesting music distribution company, and Milana will tell the story of STEM at the beginning of the episode, and then we'll dive into more technicalities. But at the later half of this episode, we talk about how Milana is incorporating psychological safety into her workplace, diversity, inclusion, and making sure that she has an executive staff that can incorporate those values and really portray those values. Now, Milana is a total rock star, and she gives away so much information and amazing details on what STEM is doing, and also hints at something that STEM is working on in the future that could be coming out later this year. So stay tuned for that. Before we dive into the episode and the conversation with Milana, I want to remind you to sign up to my email list. You can find that on lennonseahawk.com. That helps me notify you when new episodes are live. Please follow me on Instagram. That can also be found on my website, or you can just find me at Lennon Seahawk. Leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps the show get discovered by new listeners. And I believe you can also do that on Spotify now as well. You just click the 5 stars, and that helps the show get discovered by new listeners within Spotify's algorithm. If you or somebody you know would be a good guest for this show, there is a guest request form in the show notes as well, so please fill that out. Happy 2022. Welcome to the first episode of 2022 for When Life Hands You Lennon's, and let's dig in to this amazing conversation with Milana Lewis. Thanks, Milana, for being on the show. I'm really excited to chat with you. I have heard and seen so many amazing things about STEM and all the great things that you do. So can you give us just a brief background on who you are and the company, and then we'll kind of branch from there?
That question can be so deep. Who am I?
Yes, it can be. And I want you to go as deep as you possibly want to.
I think I'm going to stay a little bit more surface level for this, but maybe we can go deeper
Sure.
later in the conversation.
Sure.
So I am Milana. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called STEM. We are a platform that does distribution, payments, and offers fair and flexible capital to independent artists, labels, and others who are building a business in the music industry. I started the company, or the idea for the company came to me when I was one of the very first digital talent agents at an agency called UTA. Just sort of being at the center of the evolution of the media business, especially at the intersection of technology, witnessing how more and more creators were taking control of their business and distributing their content across multiple platforms, collaborating more frequently than ever before, and yet having no financial tools or services to help them understand how the money was coming in and how they could more simply pay out all the people that they worked with, and decided to build it.
And I was watching your conversation with Gary Vee. I believe it was last year. It was fairly recent.
I think it was 2 years ago now.
Wow. Okay. Well,
I know. It was pre-COVID.
And pandemic times, that's pretty recent. But yeah, you gave, that was a really good conversation. I took a handful of notes. So tell us a little bit about you growing up. Where did you grow up? Where are you at now, actually?
Yeah, so I'm in my home in Sherman Oaks at the moment.
Okay.
I was born in Lithuania. It's funny, Gary and I are somehow related, although we've never really tracked it through our cousins, but both of our families lived in this little village, Babrusk, which is very small. And so it's quite likely that or someone is blood related to someone else, like in our
Sure.
family tree.
Sure.
Although we met not through family, but through sort of like the entrepreneur founder circle.
Mm-hmm.
Got acquainted, and Gary's been an incredible supporter and someone who I've been lucky to sort of borrow the brain of. And at UTA, as this idea was percolating in my head, I would share it with him, and he sort of got to see the evolution of the concept and was our very first investor.
That is so cool. So what has it been like having some kind of mentor, and talk about the importance of having some kind of mentor like Gary Vee in such an evolving business, somebody who's at the forefront all the time?
Yeah. Mentorship's a really interesting term, and it's not one that I would actually use to describe my relationship with many people.
Sure.
I think that sort of implies that you have the ability to consistently go to someone. And I feel like that's just not the best way to approach advice or support. I think that there's a person who you want to establish a mutual relationship with, where you're adding value to them and they're therefore able to add value to you as well. And you find moments in time in which you can both kind of serve each other. And I think that's really important. I think that it's more valuable out of your peer group than it is someone who is at a different stage in their careers than you were. I think it's really valuable and important to get the perspective of someone who's ahead of you in their career and their journey. I think there's a lot of pattern matching that they bring to you that you can benefit from. But I think that the best sort of people I've had in my life to lean on have been my peers, have been other founders who are at the same stage as I am, or maybe slightly ahead, but not to the level of like someone like Gary, right?
Right.
And those are the kind of people that are oftentimes in the middle of figuring out the same problems that you are. And you can sort of toss things back and forth about what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I recently had a friend start up a Telegram group with, we're all producers and musicians, and we've all kind of struggled with finding motivation and like, where's our next footing in where we want to go? Because the music industry has 100,000 different avenues that you can take, and it gets overwhelming because every little sector, there's so many little spider webs that go out, and there's so many little inner workings of each space that get really overwhelming. So we started this group, and we're starting to kind of feed off of each other and send each other music. And I found it to be so helpful when you have people in a similar space that can then help you and motivate you to move to the next step in your career.
Totally. And it's just oftentimes you connect over having the same struggles and are invested in each other for that reason, like you're describing.
So talk a little bit more about STEM. I'm really curious to hear about some of the successes and some of the things that you've learned since starting the company about the music industry.
What a question. I think the most interesting thing about the music industry is how unnecessarily complex it is. Complex it is, I should say. When you sort of look at it from the outside, a lot of people are like, oh, this is such a dirty business. People are unfair to each other. It's so opaque. The industry's kind of fucked, right? And we've sort of embraced that word as part of our mission, which is to unfuck the music business. And if you start thinking about, well, why is the industry fucked? Like, what are the fundamental problems that exist? And one of them is that there's like just a total tangled mess of complexity that exists primarily because people don't really trust each other. I'll give you an example of it. So we've been digging in to understand how all the different structures work in royalty agreements between producers, artists, songwriters, the label, and so on. And one of the more fascinating things to me are the producer agreements. And how producers take an upfront advance, and therefore they don't have to stand behind a lot of the other expenses. They primarily stand behind recording costs. And it sounds simple to describe, but when you actually have to calculate the way they get paid, the term that they use is they're getting paid on the first dollar, but the first dollar is not exactly first dollar because they don't get paid right away. They retroactively get paid on the first dollar after all the expenses are recouped, which is why they take a producer advance. And when you talk to producers or lawyers and you're like, well, why do you ask for an advance? And their answer is very simple. It's because they don't believe they're ever going to get $1 again. They don't trust the label is going to actually pay them out. And they don't trust the accounting practices. So they try to estimate what the record's going to do, guesstimate, I should say, and ask for that money up front. And then should the record perform much better, then they get more back end, but it's much later down the line, if ever. And that to me is really sad. Like, imagine being an employee of a store or any other business, quite frankly, showing up to work every single day, doing your best job, and not being confident that you're going to get paid. That's wild. And yet that's the reality in the music business.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on what the first dollar means?
Yeah. It means that before anyone else, like the artist or other people have to recoup their expenses or they get paid, that the producer gets paid after like the money starts coming in.
Okay. So the trust issues are a major thing plaguing the industry. What are some things, like what would be the solution to that you think?
Yeah, I think for us, it's about driving more visibility. I hate the word transparency. We much prefer the word clarity. And the specific reason for that is because to me, transparency means giving someone a data dump and putting the pressure and onus on them to sort of swim through it and make sense of it, which is what a lot of companies do. Is like, oh, you want transparency? Boom, here's an Excel sheet with thousands of lines. Go figure it out. Yeah. We like the word clarity because it implies that there's additional work that's been done to make things easy to digest, easy to read, and easy to act on. So we try to take that as, it's actually one of our primary values as a business, is striving for clarity. So we try to drive more visibility, and then we, as a software company, we try to eliminate as much human error as possible. So how do we take complexity and simplify it to a point where anyone who's an admin can be able to do the work and fill in the blanks and trust that the system's going to handle all the complexity for them?
So you're trying to eliminate human error, which I think a lot of companies are striving for these days. I think of like Tesla, for example, is one of the, Elon says any type of human input is error, which I think is a huge step, but it's on the same line of like humans create error and computers can do things more efficiently. So what types of things does SIM do to eliminate that? Like, what is in your program that helps create that clarity?
Yeah. So let's start with how we get music distributed.
Sure.
We have a very simple interface to upload your music, fill in the credits, fill in the metadata, and fill in the artwork. And we've built in validations to make sure that as you're going through the process, we alert you if something's not right. So if your file size of the artwork is so small or corrupted, we'll let you know immediately. Sometimes people upload song files and later they need the ability to make sure that the file isn't corrupt, because sometimes there might be a glitch in it as it's being uploaded. We can check that and send it back to them right away. One of the biggest pain points is when independent artists sign with a new distributor or sign on to use a new service. If they release a song, oftentimes it creates a new profile page for them. So we built in the ability to link to your specific profile page to make sure that when you're releasing music, it's mapped to the right place. So we built in tons of validations on that end. And, what we heard initially from a lot of people is like the STEM interface makes it so easy and alleviates a lot of stress, because a lot of managers coming out of record label relationships to them, the process of even getting content distributed has been made to seem so complex, right? The labels tell them we need all the files and information 4 weeks in advance, and no, you can't make changes last minute. It doesn't get updated to our supply chain. There's all these risks. Whereas in our system, it's like, click a button, we'll tell you if you do it right or wrong, and we'll guide you through the process and we can get it up quickly. So that was part one. Part two is, as the money comes in, it's not going to one person, and that person's responsible for paying everyone else out. In our system, you can tell us who the collaborators are, what their percentage is, and you need to provide an email address for each person. And the reason why we do that is because we want to confirm that the information that the person who's uploading it is putting correctly, and that all the other people have an opportunity to review it. So we drive consensus. So our product facilitates the ability for everyone to confirm their share. And it's only after 100% consensus that all the people, click approve on the splits that everyone gets paid. And as we've launched products like Recoup, where you can now add in the budget that needs to recoup before other people get paid, every single shareholder has visibility into the budget. So we try to use product and technology to inform, drive visibility, and help create consensus, as well as enabling multiple people to have a perspective into something. Ultimately, someone might point something out that might be wrong or inaccurate, and then be in a position to help guide it to getting fixed and cleaned up. And we think that actually is really important, right? And doing that allows us to get clean metadata, which is critical.
There's an excellent article that Danny Deal wrote on The Verge. I'm sure you've seen it, about
love it.
The plaguing of the metadata issue. And she does such a deep dive and explains everything so well. I'll link it in the show notes, actually, because I was just referencing it the other day. And so can you talk about the importance of metadata and sort of dive in from a distributor's perspective, why having everything so correct and so accurate is so important when it comes to distribution, royalties, copyrights, and everything?
Yeah, because without that information, how do you know who gets paid? And I think this is one of the things that's really interesting is, on Spotify's end, or Apple, or any of these platforms, they need to know who the songwriters and producers are. And the first party that enters that information is usually the distributor or the label. And if they're not submitting it, then it becomes much harder for the publisher to go and put in that information for that information to match to the correct sound recording, or all the correct versions of the sound recordings that exist, and then be able to claim the revenue and the earnings on behalf of the songwriters and producers and other composers. It's unbelievable how inaccurate the share percentages can be. And some of it is just a rounding error, right? Because if you split a project 3 ways, it's not an even number. And if the way one system enters it includes, rounding it up to the second decimal, it's not going to add up necessarily to 100%. It's going to be slightly over. And if it's slightly over, no one gets paid. So it's little things like that are such nuances related to how metadata works that really actually matters. And it's all the parties having visibility into how the data is fed in, and having one source of truth that is actually going to fix a lot of the problems that exist, and sort of hopefully chip away at the black box that exists of all these royalties and revenues that the DSPs are holding out or holding on to, or even the publishers or the collecting societies, because they don't know who to pay, right? So we want to try to help create that source of truth, help align everyone so that they're going after that they're submitting the same information in multiple places, because it's all in one place for them to reference.
So if the DSPs and all these things have such stringent and such strict guidelines for the metadata and who they're paying, how do these errors happen? Do you guys build systems around those guidelines, or can you guys build whatever you want and then hope it fits? Or how does that connection between distributor and DSP work?
Yeah, there's metadata framework. The most commonly used one is DDEX, and they set the standard. However, companies like, I believe Apple, don't follow a DDEX, so they have their own style guides. And it's just about staying up to date with them. But even in those metadata standards, there's so many fields.
Yeah.
So our job is to take all of those fields and the guidelines for how the data needs to appear in those fields and put it into an interface that's super simple for the end user, which is oftentimes not even the manager, it's the assistant to the manager, right? Who's not necessarily trained in metadata management, to input it in a way that we can validate and make sure that it appears correctly.
Wow. So how do you make sure that the styles with Apple work with Amazon, work with YouTube, and like I would assume that the system in the back end would be pages upon pages upon pages long, because every platform seems to have their own standard.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that we do where we take the information and then we can reformat it so that the person doesn't have to do it themselves. So it's just, like I said, like it's just building software and logic and taking the complexity out of it and doing the work on behalf of the client on the back end, so that for them, it's not requiring them to do more work. And, there's a much less intensive way to do it with software, but then you're putting all the work on the human. And our point of view is like, let's make it as easy and simple for the client, and let's have the machines do the hard work.
Yeah. So a lot of people think, this is kind of a common misconception, is a lot of people think that they register for the distributor like STEM and they're good to go to collect all of their money. What types of royalties does STEM collect?
Yeah, it's a really great question, because it is something that most people are not fully educated around.
No.
And what we do is we actually, after they distribute their music, we send them an email with a checklist of like, hey, here's all the other places you need to go to register the information to collect.
Oh, wow.
And we collect primarily on the master royalties, right? So every song has 2, master and publishing. As an artist, songwriter, producer, you oftentimes need to collect the publishing share. You need to make sure it's registered with a collection society. You also need to make sure it's registered with Sound Exchange to collect the mechanical royalties from streaming primarily and radio. The streaming mechanicals are collected through your publisher, but the non-interactive ones are collected through Sound Exchange. So places like Sirius and Pandora, et cetera. And you have to make sure, as a songwriter, producer, or even an artist that's claiming songwriter, producer credit, you register, if you're truly independent, as both a publisher and a songwriter, because you need to collect both the publisher share and the songwriter share. And you have an admin for the publisher share, but you can collect the songwriter share directly. So it's a lot of things to figure out. And there's luckily been great other platforms that exist, like Song Trust, that help simplify that process. A lot of business managers and lawyers are well educated in it. There's accounting and royalty firms that are specialized in it that can help guide artists. And then the really responsibility is on the managers to get more educated, to be able to know how to do these things. And I think that that's an area that as an industry, we haven't invested in a lot, right? Like, to be an agent, you have to come up the ranks. You get trained from the mailroom, from sitting on desks, you learn processes, you learn the best. But to be a manager, you can be a best friend of an artist and then end up in a position where you're suddenly managing the career of a star, or someone that went viral on TikTok now has a #1 hit on today's top hits on Spotify, and you've never learned any of this stuff, right? And we encounter a lot of those people. And so we take on the responsibility to help try to educate them ourselves and try to create some level of simplicity for them, where we can help guide them towards all the steps that they need to do, because we can't assume that they know how to do them all. And I think education is a big part of unfucking the business as well. Like, we were sort of talking earlier, you mentioned how, Elon Musk's believe that humans can create error. I think I want to be really clear when I say that I don't think technology can solve all the pain points of the music business. Sure. I think what's incredible about humans is that they're imperfect. They tell amazing stories. They create art as a result of it. And what we want to do is enable those people to do what they're great at. But we never underestimate their ability to be business people and to care about the business. And I think that's a big differentiator. There's a lot of other people are like, artists care about the art, managers care about part of the business, but they're really great at shaping the art. And we're taking the point of view that you can actually do both. If you have the right technology that can guide you through managing the business, then you're freed up to spend more of your time in figuring out the art piece. And yet you have a tool that can help you be more effective, efficient, and more of a superhuman.
I love that. I think that's amazing. Really good information. So I also want to go back to the MLC is a new thing as well, the Mechanical Licensing Collective. What is that, and does that affect your business and who you're paying when it comes to mechanical licenses?
Yeah. If you haven't already, you should get Dave Bogan on as a guest who can talk a lot more about the MLC and their initiatives.
Sure.
But it was an organization that was created to help ensure that mechanicals were being paid out properly from streaming to various rights holders, and that is their mission.
Great. And do you guys pay out royalties to them?
Yeah, so we don't, because the mechanical streaming royalties are held with the streaming services. They don't pass it down to the distributor.
Got it.
But we have been talking with Dave a little bit, and we have to probably pick up those conversations around how we can actually be more effective partners and ensuring that there's metadata matching and all of that, so that it makes it easier for the publishers and other people to claim the royalties on behalf of the people they represent.
Sure. So transitioning just a little bit, I want to talk about you as a female CEO and executive in such a male-dominated industry. What has that been like, kind of growing such a hugely successful company in this kind of crazy industry?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying hugely successful. I think we're still in our infancy.
No, you're hugely successful.
We'll see about that. We hope to be one day. We have a lot of work to do. I don't know. I don't know what it's like to be a male founder or an entrepreneur in this business either, right? So to me,
Sure.
I have no reference point for that. Do I feel like sorry, my dog's scratching at the door. Let me let her out for 1 second.
Sure.
Give her some and turn around. Do I feel like I've been at a disadvantage? I don't know. I really don't think that way in terms of like gender norms, privilege. I do believe that I have a tremendous amount of privilege in that I've been able to access relationships and people, and, haven't had as many biases against what I'm doing other than my gender. Which is a very different experience for many other founders, right? I didn't come up in a wealthy family at all. I came up in one that was very working class, and therefore I learned how to work and the ethic to work. And my dad's a dreamer, so I learned how to dream and how to have a vision, and was lucky enough to be able to guide myself, because it's not like my parents could help me navigate music. They don't come from this world at all. But navigate an industry to get people to align with my vision and make a bet on it. But I do sort of, because I felt so empowered, I think it's really important to empower the people that, we work with and the people that work at STEM. And it's something that we're incredibly committed to their growth. And I kind of want to pay forward that. And I think if you talk to a lot of the women that have had, have worked directly for me and other women on the team, that they hopefully also feel incredibly empowered. And I've pushed them to not feel like, how do I say this? Like that anything's possible, right? That's sort of the ethos that I try to instill in other people.
So how do you instill that sense of empowerment? Like, what are some things that you do to empower the other women and people that you work with, or that work for you and with you?
Yeah, I think it starts with having conversations about, big ideas. How do you create psychological safety in a setting so that people can bring ideas to you? And a lot of people have ideas, but they don't know how to execute or how to move them forward. So how can you take something and break it down into tactical next steps? And so providing people with frameworks to do that. A conversation I love having with people, and this is something that I learned through an executive coach that I got the benefit to work with, which is asking people about what is their vision for themselves. And then where do they think they are today? And then what are those gaps and how do you close them? And I think it's through those types of conversations that you can really help facilitate healthy growth conversations. And that's the beginning of actually being able to help empower someone, is by helping them become more conscious of their gaps, but also feel empowered to close those gaps with getting additional resources, skills, mentorship, coaching. There's so many different ways to address it. Sometimes the biggest missing gap is just time. And if that's the issue, then you figure out how you help someone identify the things they want to delegate to elevate themselves.
I love the term psychological safety. I think that's a really important, and I've really focused on mental health the last year and a half, and I've really pushed other people to take care of themselves mentally, because it's such a stigma. And, especially with men and masculinity, like talking about your feelings is such a, no, but you don't want to talk about your feelings. You're a man, just get over it, when it's really not that easy. But as a leader, how do you start that conversation and address somebody and start digging into psychological safety? How would you start a conversation like that with an employee?
It's interesting because I was terrible at it initially.
Sure.
Awful. Like, I think if you talk to any of our initial early employees, I did not create a psychologically safe environment. I was way too aggressive, and I had just completely unrealistic expectations that weren't grounded. And I think a lot of that is because of my upbringing through a talent agency, which is a very cutthroat environment, right? There's not any psychological safety in those environments for the most part. And in fact, they're environments that are driven by fear of failure.
Yeah.
And it was through investing in myself and through coaching and through realizing that operating this way was not going to deliver the types of results that I wanted to. And more importantly, surrounding myself with a peer network of other founders who were driving more success and understanding how and why they were doing it, and realizing the common thread was through creating psychological safety. Right. And so for me, what I realized is that I don't have to put up this front to pretend like everything's okay and I know everything and everything's good. And the moment I started to really embrace vulnerability is when I started seeing a shift in how other people began to trust me and began to open up. And it's everything from, when we were all in an office together, being able to go on walks with people and sort of, drive a connection and understand how they're feeling and why they're feeling certain things. One of the interesting tools I've sort of picked up is people sometimes say things like, I feel that you are, or I feel like, and usually none of those are actually feeling words. And so how to help guide people to actually describing their feelings is really powerful when you can get them to open up that way, because then you can actually get to the root of the problem. So that's one of those things. The other thing is, I started doing this thing last year that my husband hates and I talk about now all the time, which is working from bed.
Oh.
And for me, I decided to be really open about it with my team. Like, I would jump on Zooms and I'd be in bed and they would be taken aback initially, like, oh my God, our CEO is working from bed. Why is this happening? And it's like, guys, we've all been in this like crazy world.
Yes.
And we're all fucking tired and we don't need to fake it. Let's be honest and check in with how we're feeling today. And if we're just not feeling it, that's okay. Like, take care of yourself. And it's funny because today I was actually going to work from bed, but I saw we had this podcast and I saw we were on video, and I had a moment where like I was consciously debating, do I work from bed and just embrace the fact and sort of do this interview with you? And a part of me was like, I feel like people are going to hate me for it. And now that we're having this conversation, maybe I should have, right?
That would have been totally awesome.
What?
That would have been totally awesome if you were just working from bed. That would have been my first podcast episode where my guest was in bed.
That would have been amazing. I should have done that. I texted Lindsay, who's our publicity manager, and I was like, Lindsay, do I have to be on camera and be camera ready? And she said yes. And that's when I was like, fuck, gotta get out of bed. Maybe I should have just gone with it anyways. No,
Yeah.
but I mean, seriously, like that's really powerful, right? We've had so many challenges in the business, and there were moments where the company could have completely died and shut down, but luckily we were pushing through. And in those moments, instead of pretending like everything's okay, I was like, guys, this is really hard. Here's the problems we're dealing with as a business. And here's sort of my plan on how to address them, but I could be wrong.
Mm.
Right? Like not everything's perfect. And I think that when you're an early stage company, and I was a first-time founder, I am a first-time founder at this stage still, even though I'm almost 7 years in, you kind of have to fake it till you make it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we all have such severe, what's it called? Oh my God, now I'm blanking on the term.
FOMO?
No, not FOMO. Like
Can you describe it? Like what it means?
it means like you're kind of faking it too much and like you don't believe you actually have what it takes. Something syndrome.
Oh,
Imposter syndrome.
Yes.
There
Imposter
we go.
syndrome.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Lindsay. She just texted me yet. Imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah. So that's interesting. I like the approach of psychological safety and having these conversations because it's such an important thing. So what kind of changed when you had these conversations, when you started having these conversations and making that shift? What types of things did you see immediately in your company and maybe even in your personal life?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges was, so if you're not driving people to be afraid of failure and you're in fact embracing failure, how do you draw a line in the sand between being ruinously empathetic with that versus holding people accountable? Because if you fail, there's a lot to learn from there. So how are you constructive with failure? How are you productive? How do you help people become productive in failing? Because if you fail too much without learning and moving on and growing, like that's not a good thing either. So that was a big challenge to figure out how we drive accountability in failure. And creating psychological safety without accountability is actually also ruinously empathetic. And that's a problem. So you can't just create a space for people to feel like it's okay to not show up emotionally. It's okay to share ideas, but not execute or be held accountable for them. So there still needs to be accountability and guidelines to help people work through that. But I think, when we started letting people fail, initially we were ruinously empathetic with it, where like there was very little accountability. And then we were like, okay, well, we need to drive accountability now. Because you have permission to fail as long as you can explain why you failed. And ahead of doing something experimental, we ask you to define what success looks like.
Okay.
So like you want to try something different? Great. What are the resources that are necessary? What's the duration of the experiment and what does success look like?
And what can success look like? Is it money? Is it fame? Is it what have you seen it look like?
Impact, right?
Impact. Okay.
Success can be, hey, I just want to test this thing and test my hypothesis. It's likely going to be false, but I'm not going to be able to move past this idea unless I see it fail. And that's okay too.
Yeah.
And I think you're bringing up a really good point is a lot of people don't know how to define success for themselves.
Sure.
And so maybe it's not an issue of psychological safety of bringing up a new idea or challenging something. It's that they don't know what success looks like with that.
Yeah. So another question that kind of comes to mind is as you're helping and growing and providing these psychological safety nets for people and empowering them to become better, there comes this line of like, okay, now I'm becoming better. I need to move on to the next stage in my career, which may lead to me leaving this position. And I've had jobs and worked for people that have done that where they haven't allowed growth and have kept your growth at a certain level.
Yeah.
So how do you empower people, but also help them remain loyal and kind of stick around?
Yeah, I mean, we've lost some of our top performers because that,
Mm.
like, we had someone join STEM as an intern and they progressed in 4 years or almost 4 years to being a manager. And at some
Wow.
point, they were like, I'm just tired and I want to try something else. I've never had another job.
Mm.
And with those people, you're like, all right, go out in the world and explore. And hopefully one day you come back.
Yeah.
So that's the reality there too. But how do you retain people? You got to understand what motivates them. You got to understand what drives them. You got to understand how to move that forward. But I do think it's a huge challenge because, people want to experience different things. They also have their motives and their motivations might change with their lives. Right. So I think that is a huge challenge that we haven't fully solved yet. But I think it does all start with having the ability to have those conversations and check-ins on a regular basis with people. There's also people, quite frankly, that have left STEM because they haven't felt psychological safety despite our efforts to drive that kind of environment.
Mm. And how does that make you feel with all the efforts that you're doing?
There's a lot more we can be doing, right?
Mm.
We're just at the beginning of it. I think,
Sure.
we've been great at attracting diverse talent, but I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that there's a really truly inclusive environment, right? And it doesn't have to be just based on gender, sexuality, racial identity. It could also be based on, social status, financial status, and all of those things, right? Like if you look at some of the bigger music companies, a lot of the entry-level staff are being paid less than what the living minimal, like not the legal minimum wage, but like the livable minimum wage in California, right? It's an expensive place to live. So unless you have your parents helping you, like you can't take one of those jobs. So our attempt at solving for that is actually not to pay hourly fees to our employees at our entry level, but paying what we think is a livable minimum wage of California.
Mm.
So doing things like that hopefully create psychological safety because you're enabling people to not have to work second jobs.
Mm. Mm. That's a good point. And I mean, the whole politics of the minimum wage is ridiculous. It's so out of touch. It stems from a lot of issues. I went back home to Minnesota, a very small rural town in Minnesota, and it's very, behind the times. And living in Los Angeles is very progressive and forward thinking. But I think of, I had conversations with people where they talked about there's a Dollar General in town and there's a grocery store and they're only open like 50 hours a week because they can't get people to work. And people are like, well, why wouldn't you show up for a job that you got hired for? But it's like, you look at this, you work for a large corporation that probably pays you less than minimum wage and trying to raise a family, like you can't afford to pay anything.
Yeah.
Like why would I go to work for a job where I can't get health insurance, I can't get dental, I can't care for my family, I can't afford my student loans, and like the burden, I'm spending all this time working 40, 50 hours a week and I can't even afford to live. And that's a big conversation that I think is being really brought to the forefront. And I think it's a really good conversation that we're having. I love how everybody is leaving their jobs and kind of starting fresh and realizing all these things because people are starting to stand up.
Yeah. And it's necessary, right? Like I hope employers like that, listen, like grocery stores are a terrible margin business. They're like operating on razor thin margins there.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of issues there, especially as supply chain becomes more complex. And, I'm sure they can justify why they can't pay more than that for, minimum wage for their workers. But at the same time, there's other things they can do likely to help create a more equitable environment for those workers, right? Or more flexibility where there's
Absolutely.
trade-offs in that. And that's really hard. And I don't blame a lot of people for not wanting to go back to work, especially while they've luckily been able to get government support. But I do hope that it forces bigger companies, at least, that are operating on healthy margins, who have traditionally been taking advantage of their entry-level workers or labor workers and paying the minimum wage, to rethink their practices.
Mm-hmm. Not to name any names, but Walmart is
Yeah.
kind of one
And
of the
we've seen
big.
examples of Costco being incredibly successful in providing great working environments for their staff with more fair and equitable compensation. But, similarly, like, let's look at the music business, right? I think it's bullshit that there isn't like more benefits in healthcare or types of support for artists, songwriters, producers. And primarily it's because a lot of their income is unstable. It's on a project basis. And being in a position like that where, they fall into what I think of as like an underserved community when it comes to financial opportunities a lot of the time, right? Like try going to a bank and getting a loan. Whether it's to start a business or buy a house, it's really hard to put together a stable financial picture when you're in the creative space. And it's one of the reasons we created the Scale facility with STEM, which is the ability to borrow money from your royalty income, from the money you're getting paid off your music. And you don't have to provide any personal guarantee. You don't have to provide any of your other income statements. We just look at the money you're making through STEM and we can give you an advance and you can use it for whatever you want. You can use it for marketing. You can use it for paying your rent. You can use it to put down money towards a down payment or finance a house because maybe a bank doesn't understand it. We've had clients do all of those things. And we hope to be able to, as we grow, offer more and more other types of financial services to the clients that we work with, which aren't just the artist, right? We pay out songwriters, producers, collaborators, and with the tools that we're building, we hope to facilitate payments to more people on their team, whether it's their manager, their publicist, their whoever they employ or pay to help them create and run their business.
I love that this kind of transition away from banks as well. And like, I don't need to go to the bank and prove my income because my distributor can do it. Like I can get a loan from my distributor for 30 grand and put a really nice down payment on a house right now. And there's no strings attached. I just have to keep doing what I love.
Yeah.
So
and I think that's one of the exciting things with the creator revolution that we're seeing happening right now.
yeah, I love the whole Web 3.0, NFTs, the metaverse. I'm really kind of delving into that as well. It's so overwhelming. I'm not sure if you've dived into it at all or.
Stay tuned for some fun news from STEM in the Web3 world.
Cool. I'm excited to see all of that. But yeah, I just started reading about the Ethereum blockchain and I write articles for EDM.com all the time about it. But I want to start investing in art and giving back. So the money goes directly to the artist rather than through 600,000 companies and major corporations and all this stuff.
Ooh, that is a fallacy.
You think so?
I know so.
Oh, you know so? How so?
Because if you look at the example of some of the artists that have sold music NFTs, even though they get the money first, all the other entities come to them chasing them for their share. So the publishers, the PROs, the label, they all are still getting their share. It's just going to the artist first instead of the other way, which it goes through the middleman and then to the artist. Interesting.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
So how is that working then?
It's not.
So if I buy an NFT for say 1 Ethereum on OpenSea, the artist will get that money, but then the publishers send emails and stuff like, "Hey, we want." How do they know? How do they know it was even sold?
Because if it's big enough, they'll know. It's their job to know.
So if it's small enough, they won't know.
Possibly. For now. It's
Everybody's
interesting. Like I've seen a couple of new agreements from labels to artists, and they're all including NFT rights, or trying to at least.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
What about graphic art? I suppose, are they trying to do like some type of 360 deal where they can collect on everything?
Name and likeness, right? Because remember, when they're signing the artist, they're buying the name and they're licensing the name and likeness as well.
But for independent artists that don't have a record deal,
yeah, they're free.
They're free.
Yeah, but if there's musical content in there, then the publishers have a right to claim.
That makes sense.
Especially if there's other collaborators that they're claiming on behalf of.
That makes sense.
Talk to Justin Blau.
Yeah.
His experiences.
Yeah, interesting.
He's very publicly about it.
Okay, I'll have to find that. I know he was kind of the talk of the town last year when he did that $12 million drop, which
Yeah.
is amazing. But I can imagine the headache that it created
Yeah.
amongst the label publishers, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. There's no label involved, luckily for him, but yeah, on the publishing side, there were some
On the
issues.
publishing side. Oh, Lord. So kind of the last thing that I want to talk about is you talked about diversity and inclusion. And I think that's a really, really important topic today that I'm trying to educate myself more on and trying to be more inclusive on as well in my writings and everything that I do. So can you talk about the statement that you put out a few years ago on your goals, and then what STEM is doing actively to promote diversity and inclusion, specifically with people of color and Black people?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, listen, it is, what's nice about us is that our business is fundamentally in line with those values, and that our job is to create economic opportunities or enable our clients to create economic opportunities for themselves. And to me, a lot of the themes around what we saw with Black Lives Matter and the show must be stopped and all of that really came down to the fundamental reality that a lot of people of color did not feel like they had access to economic opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a business, we take that really seriously. And in order for us to be able to execute on our mission, we have to ensure that our team that's actually behind the product, behind the services, looks and has the same experience as our client base. So in terms of recruiting and, more importantly, retention of talent, it's the number one priority of our executive team to make sure that we're facilitating not only diverse, but inclusive, and most importantly, an equitable environment. And over the last couple of weeks, we've been having DE&I training with an executive coach that's facilitated seminars for the executive team. And it started with us defining what inclusion, equity, and belonging mean at STEM. And creating a roadmap around some of those goals. And it starts with everything from how do we broaden and diversify our recruiting efforts, and even little things that we've always been conscious of is how do we make sure the job descriptions we're posting do not detract or discourage people from applying. Like there's data out there that people of color and women, if they feel like they don't check all the boxes for the job description in terms of like requirements or nice to have, they won't apply. So how do we make even like the way that we're appealing to people feel more inclusive? To how do we run a interview process that creates a really great candidate experience? And then how do we thoroughly onboard our people to get them assimilated into the business as quickly as possible? And how do we create channels for feedback and communication for growth? I think the thing that we failed in the past with is, training our managers on how to have great growth conversations. I think our executives were good at that, but the people in the middle were maybe not as strong. So one of the things that is a priority for us this year is how do we train our managers to give great feedback and have growth conversations? Because unless you're good at giving feedback, you're not able to help guide someone to grow. And I think there's a lot of instances where managers are ruinously empathetic when they don't feel like they have the right tools to give great feedback that's actually constructive and growth oriented. So that's our number one priority as a business, is to eliminate that as a challenge for us.
So what are some things that artists and, let's say on the artist side, maybe not specifically hiring directly through STEM, but on, say, royalties or becoming a client of STEMs, what are some things that you guys are doing?
Yeah. I mean, on that end, we have an incredibly diverse roster, right? Which is why the diversity is so important for us. I'm proud to say that we have our top artists are all incredibly diverse.
Good.
But we are an invite-only platform. We are exclusive. We're not for everyone.
Sure.
And what we look for isn't just numbers. It really is about, can we serve you in a way that is different or better than an experience you would have with someone else? So there's a lot of younger artists that come to us that we deny And they get upset because they're like, but you're for independent artists and yet you're not accepting me. And it's like, well, we're not actually the place to help develop you or grow you.
Mm.
Like our unique value proposition and the offering that we've created is really specific to supporting artists where they're at a point in their careers where they need to help make sure that, one, they can elevate the strategy, right? There's already a manager in place. There's already a brand and identity figured out for the artist, but they need help and someone to help advocate on their behalf with the DSPs to procure placement opportunities. So it's not as much about discovery, it's more about strategic placements and someone who can help connect dots and augment the existing relationships with the management team. The second thing is you got to be hyper collaborating. You have to be in a place where there's people for us to pay, because if we're not able to help you solve your pain point of managing your expenses and your revenue and the payouts, like we're not adding that much more value to you as a business. So for us, it's been about product and service focus, which is one of the biggest things that determine the qualifications for what we look for in clients, because we want to make sure that like, if you're coming to STEM, you're actually going to get the value that you're paying for versus going somewhere else. Like you could be paying a flat fee to DistroKid or TuneCore and get exactly what you need out of them, where it's not worth you paying a percentage for us.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's a really good point. If it's not adding value, then why would you? What's the point? So what are some of the things that you guys are looking for? Like, what are the 3 things that you guys look for when taking on somebody?
Yeah, the first thing is there a team around them? And then the second thing is there someone at STEM that feels really strongly about advocating for this person and has a point of view?
Okay.
And really those are the 2 things.
Okay.
If there's not someone at STEM that has a point of view about how to help you grow, you're better off somewhere else.
And like, is this somebody that at STEM that has had to have heard of this artist, or
we have, so when someone comes our way, we always guide them, if they haven't already, to fill out the application on our website. That information gets fed to a system that all of the artist relations team has access to. And on a weekly basis, and like consistently people are going through applications. And we filter it internally so that it ends up in the right sort of area in terms of genre and taste profile. So the right people are considering it. And if there's someone that's excited, they'll take it on. It doesn't really matter the numbers behind the person, what stage they're at. They sort of look at the holistic story that the person put into the application about themselves with, their bio, some of the existing traction they've had, links to existing music or new music. And they sort of consider like, hey, does this person excite me? Do I feel passionately about this person? Do I want to help them, guide them in their career? Because every client at STEM has a dedicated account manager. And now we're building out a strategy team and function that is also going to help complement the account managers that are working day to day with these clients.
And what does a strategy look like for one of the artists through STEM?
It's everything from how should we be spending against this next release, right? Like what is the appropriate budget? And out of the budget, how should we be allocating it towards video content versus social? Should we be focusing it on a territory versus going broad? Once the song's released, what is the data coming back and how do we take it from there? What do we do to continue to put gas towards this project? If let's say a client's like, hey, I need to hire a PR team. Well, what's the appropriate PR team and who are the couple of vendors that we can recommend for that client? If someone wants to do a TikTok influencer campaign, what are the types of agencies or companies or individuals they should be working with? How do we help connect the dots? So it's everything from using our pretty broad Rolodex of service providers, individuals, vendors, and helping match them to the needs of our clients and helping them navigate those. And it could also be something as simple as an artist coming to us that doesn't have management yet, or just is in the middle of transitioning management, which is what happens more frequently than not. And then being like, I need a new manager. And the first thing we do is help them guide a conversation around like, well, what are you looking for? Because managers come in different shapes and sizes, right? So how do we help map you to a person who actually is going to help push your business forward? And are there a couple of introductions that we can make for you?
Okay. That's, and then you guys help with like playlist support. Do you do ad spend like on Facebook and stuff like that?
So we can help augment that in-house, but we typically point people to the appropriate agency of their size of spend.
Okay.
One of the things that we believe is that if we want to scale, building those services in-house doesn't actually scale. And there's so many incredible boutique companies or agencies that are set up to super serve clients in very specific areas. And our job is to know how to navigate them. So we rather give clients the money to hire those people directly with the guidance to navigate who those vendors are.
Mm. Okay, that makes sense. I think, yeah, and doing in-house marketing is a whole beast in and of itself.
Yeah, and you can't do it great for as a diverse roster as we have, because being great at marketing an emerging songwriter who's an artist is very different than a trap artist, which looks very different than a country artist, right? And we have all of those.
Mm. What is your how many employees do you have at STEM?
It's a good question. So we're somewhere under 40. I don't know the exact number today, but
okay.
In the next year, we're probably going to get to 100. So
wow.
we've been at a small sort of size for the last year or so as we've been heads down and really refining the offering and pushing out product. And now we're getting ready to scale.
Wow, that's exciting. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
So how many artists do you have signed to STEM?
We actually have no idea. We don't pay attention to how many artists we have. It's not a metric we care about.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And what's kind of your most popular genre or style?
We're pretty we're pretty diverse, but I would say the three genres, which I believe are sort of equal, are hip hop, country, and electronic.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And we look at that based on revenue, not based on number of artists signed.
Sure.
Because again, like the reason why we don't care about how many artists there are, because artists isn't actually the right metric. It's how many people do we pay.
Right. That's a good point. And across how many countries?
I have no idea.
No idea? Wow. Well, I would assume that if you have a lot of artists like that, it's probably across a number of countries. So that's really cool. That's really cool.
I mean, our home base is in the US, but we definitely have clients across the world.
Okay. That's amazing. Well, that's kind of all the questions that I have for you. This was such a really, really good conversation.
Yeah.
You shared so many amazing tips and insight. Got to learn quite a bit more about STEM. So thank you for sharing all of your stories and insights. And I wish you nothing but success in the next couple years.
I really appreciate the time, and I love sort of the depth of the depth and range of the conversation as well. So thank you for guiding that.
Of course.
And having me as a guest today.